cubed, and that is minus 836.74. Finally, let's compute the sum of all these payments. Well, we've designed it in a way that in the years 1, 2, and 3, there will be zeros, right? And these zeros are important because of the risk argument, right? So we want to have a strategy where we never lose money. So how can we ensure that, or how can we argue that this is free of risk? Well, I have to make these payments here, minus 50, minus 50, minus 1,050. And these are cash flows I get from the bank. So the question is the bank free of risk, right? Do I receive these cash flows with certainty? Fortunately for us, there is a protection mechanism for banks called deposit insurance. That means if you deposit money on your bank account, there's kind of a government insurance for it, up to 100,000 euros per bank account. Right? So if the bank goes bankrupt and you have 50,000 euros on the bank account, the government would pay the money back to you within a couple of days. Right? It's actually quite important to figure out where the bank officially is located that you're dealing with. As an example, we had a colleague here actually at the school who was investing at a Russian bank. Right? Shortly before the war started, right? So, and we interrupted, of course, the financial ties to Russia. And now the big question was, did she actually deposit the money in Russia itself? Right? So was it just a branch of the bank, so officially located in Russia, because then the deposit insurance applicable will be the Russian insurance scheme. And if you don't speak Russian, it will be, and again, in these times, it's probably difficult to get your money back. But fortunately for her, they actually created a subsidiary in Germany, or she was in Austria. Right? So if it's a separate company, a separate legal entity, the deposit insurance scheme of that country is in effect. So actually the European legislation was valid and she got the money back immediately. Right? But that was because they had a subsidiary here and we're in the branch. Right? So it's quite important to figure out if you have money in the bank account, which is the authority that's relevant. Is it German or some international? I think basically the rules in the European Union is always the same. It's 100,000 euros, which are guaranteed. Right. The banks actually have to pay a small insurance premium for that, and there's a fund collecting money. So the Russian banks, which were subsidiaries in Germany, they basically got the customers got reimbursed. There was a default a couple of years ago. The Grenfell Bank, I think it was an Irish bank. So again, the private customers usually got their money back, but there was some customers, like I think some municipalities, who had more than 100,000 euros in the bank account, and of course they lost a lot of money. Right? So it's up to a certain amount is the protection. So in our trade here, we can argue that the bank, because of deposit insurance, is risk-free. So we can be pretty sure that we will receive these payments. So there is no risk for us involved. Right? That's important for us. Alternatively, and that was the other way of doing this, alternatively you could argue that you're buying government bonds, which are zero bonds with maturities 1, 2, 3 years, and these here would be exactly the prices you pay for those zero bonds, and then the person giving you the money here would be the government. Again, the government can be argued to be quite risk-free, and so the risk argument I think is hopefully clear from this. The risk argument runs down to having the zeros here with certainty, so I hope that's okay. Now let's look at the zero cost argument and the profit argument by summing up the cash flows at t equal to 0.
70.5.
So either, I think I put a typo in here. The number doesn't make sense. Yeah, I already saw it. So this number here is wrong. So this should be 896.74. The reason for that is that I do know what the number is that should come up. I do know that the bond trades at 1,000. The price should be 989.5. What's the difference? The difference is 10.5. And that's exactly the difference that should end up here. Right? So that's why I immediately saw that this is wrong. So this should be plus 10.5. which is the difference of the actual price the bond should have and the bond that it trades at, right? And that's the amount of money you can pocket using arbitrage. And by the way, for this strategy, it doesn't matter whether the price is too low or too high. If the price is too low, you would just buy the bond and do the opposite. So instead of putting money into the bank account, you would borrow the money from the bank. You would also make a profit, right? So the only way you don't make a profit is if the bond trades exactly at 989.5. So whether the price is too low or too high, it doesn't matter, it creates arbitrage. Now what have we done? We've applied actually the principle of replication here. So by putting these amounts of money into the bank account, we've replicated the cash flows of the bond, right? 50, 50, 1050, right? So if we created an alternative strategy to get the same cash flows, and these two strategies, either buying the bond or putting the money in the bank account, must have the same price or arbitrage is feasible. In our language here, this would now be a free lunch, right? Because the profit occurs today. So typically the biggest problem is to figure out what to buy and what to sell. But don't worry if you don't get it right in the first. So one thing will be, like we did here, compute the fair price first if you know whether it's too high or too low. But suppose you didn't know that. Suppose we haven't done this here. You don't know that the fair price is this. You could just start in one direction, and then if you did something wrong, what will happen is that you will have a negative number here. So don't panic when you see that. Don't cross anything out. The only thing that you need to do is reverse your strategies. If this is negative, then you should, instead of shorting, you should buy it, and instead of putting money into the deposit account, you should borrow it. Right? So everything that's in the table is still correct, right? You did the right steps. We just have to flip the signs of the transactions. So whenever it's a negative number, don't panic, especially in the exam. Don't cross anything out. Just write below one sentence. I see it's negative, so I have to flip my transactions. I have to do the opposite to actually capture the arbitrage. And that would be a perfectly valid solution, right? So you can just do it by trial and error if you want, right? Because the problem, in this case, it might have been obvious using the present value method, but sometimes it's not obvious what the fair value of something should be, right? And then if you don't want to guess, just get started in one direction, and if it's a minus there, then do the opposite. If it's a plus, you're done, right? So just get started and don't lose time kind of pondering over kind of the trades. Yeah, so I've mentioned that you can, so this here is kind of a replication strategy. We'll come back to this, to the bonds and interest rate products later in the lecture, and I will show you how you can do this with the zero bonds as well. Okay. So maybe one point on the short selling. So suppose that short selling is actually not feasible. Suppose that we can't do that, right? Which is something that I've argued that private investors can't do. Does that mean that this price difference would be sustained in the market, or is there still a way kind of how the market could correct itself? If short selling is not feasible. And correcting the correction strategy would be kind of doing this here, right? You sell the bond to kind of drive down the price, or you create supply for the bond, and that should drive down the price. Is there maybe someone else who could do this strategy without using short sales? So a house like this, the answer is probably yes. So who can do this strategy without doing short sales? Well, they're just people who own the bond, right? Yeah. So there must be people in the past who bought it at whatever price and who want to have the stream of cash flows. And what they can do, they can just exchange their position. They can sell the bond and put the money in the bank account. They will keep the same stream of cash flows in the future, but they will pocket the extra difference. And in that case, it's technically not short selling because they sell something that they actually do own, right? So the owners of the bond can always do this strategy. we as kind of who do not have the bond before, we couldn't do short selling. So that would be a restriction that it's a trade which is not feasible to do by everyone, so it's not technically our arbitrage definition, but there will be still some corrective mechanism in the market. That was just one example that might make this strategy more difficult. There are actually more things in the market which might kind of prevent an arbitrage trade to be undertaken. Do you have any idea of what these things could be? Like what could make this difficult to do?